Hello and welcome to Infocus. This is G Sampath. When we think of the battle against climate change, what comes to mind is carbon emissions, and the need to decarbonize the economy. But lately, there is another front against the battle against climate change that has opened up, and these are non carbon pollutants, also known as short lived climate pollutants or SLCPs. These include gases and chemicals like methane, hydrofluorocarbons, black soot, tropospheric ozone, and so on. So, why are these SLCPs or non carbon pollutants considered dangerous? What is their impact? What activities produce them? And what are the ways of mitigating their impact and their production? To discuss all these questions, we have with us Zareen Osho, Director India Program with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Zareen, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here. And to start with, Zareen, I was just going to ask you about all this discussion around climate change has been dominated by carbon emissions, greenhouse gases and so on. And the short lived climate pollutants have been rather marginal to this entire discourse until recently. So, why do you think this has been the case, and what caused this shift? Is it like more recent scientific research which has sort of focused more on these? What caused this shift, and what is going on here?
That's a great question to start with, Sampath, and I think you've sort of hit the bullseye there. When the climate discourse, as we know it today, had been initiated by the UNFCCC, which stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the United Nations Environment Program, and different countries came together. And I'm talking about early 90s, when there was enough and more scientific material at the time to talk about what climate change is, how does this affect us. The simple science was what is climate change, what is causing it, and we then started looking into what anthropogenic or man-made or human-made sources of climate change were, and the one prominent gas in that discourse was carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide also happens to be the largest found greenhouse gas on the planet. And as a result of that, the discourse at the time, the spotlight was put on carbon dioxide. Then, as decades and science evolved, and we had more and more of these scientific gatherings, we had something called as the IPCC formed, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In a very simple sense, it's the scientific body that creates consent based science. And you can well imagine how difficult consent is to gather.
But scientific facts don't really care whether there is consent or not. They are
No,
factual.
not entirely. I think that's where the meat of the matter is. So, how does science evolve? Science evolves based on climate models. You can make a model, I can make a model. Your assumptions are your assumptions, my assumptions are my assumptions. Now we can counter each other's assumptions, and that is where the consent of different scientists representing their different countries and different agendas comes into play. So historically, the discourse on climate has been controlled by global north, and they have been able to control it, and effectively so, because the scientists had access to more data. For instance, India is not amongst the rest of the global south, where our scientific discourse is as weak, as is steadily growing, but that space has always been consumed by the global north. So even when today we talk about science, it's not as simple as the sun rises in the east and therefore it's a fact and therefore everybody should agree with it, because different climate models will pull out different outputs, and those outputs are going to be determined by what the input is, so to say. And the input will be determined by what the output needs to be. And that is where the climate politics comes in. And this is exactly what happened with climate science, with regard to non CO2, where the carbon dioxide as a gas was the largest gas. And they said, let's just focus on this. And then obviously, with time, IPCC evolved, with time, science evolved, with time, the data collection, the climate models became stronger, to a point now where we've had three climate summits, the three big climate meetings, which are called the Conference of the Parties, or COP for short, where we've seen this sudden need for countries to talk about non CO2. So that's the evolution of the non CO2 discourse. And How we deal with it now is going to be a factor based on politics of climate.
Right. I mean, it's very like fascinating to hear you talk about the politics of climate change. Because generally people tend to sort of uh, give this projection that it's all science based, and that's all there is to it. But we'll come back to that in a bit. But before that, I wanted to ask you about this SLCPs and their impact. Now, one thing which we keep hearing repeatedly is that they are very critical in terms of generating near-term global warming, as opposed to carbon, which is a longer-term global warming. Now, if your planet is going to get warmer, it is going to get warmer near term and also over the longer term. So, why this distinction? Why do we have to make this distinction between near-term global warming and longer term? And your reports also speak about a sprint and a marathon. What is the need for this distinction? Why can't we just focus on the entire warming phenomenon?
Exactly. So you quoted one of the reports that the organization IGSD has done. We often talk about a dual strategy of a marathon and a sprint. The marathon, think of it, is a longer term race, right? You have to start slowly and then you know, complete the distance. It's not speed. That is carbon dioxide. And why do we say that? This is science, and this is the interesting bit of climate science, right? Carbon dioxide, if you look at the climate models and how we understand climate science as a whole, carbon dioxide is considered to be the baseline. So every time you have to quantify, is methane a more potent greenhouse gas than than carbon dioxide? You essentially have to have a benchmark against which you measure different gases. That benchmark is CO2, carbon dioxide, at which where we look at carbon, 1 unit of CO2 or carbon dioxide is equivalent to 1 unit of global warming potential. So with 1 ton of CO2, you will experience one global warming potential. That's the math, simple maths, very fundamental. Now, what happens is, again, history of climate change and politics of climate change have a lot to do with why this distinction has come about. Because when you look at the IPCC and you look at the climate models, uh, all the current metrics in 2025 as on date are benchmarked to something called as global warming potential 100, GWP 100. You must have seen this. What does that mean? That means you are benchmarking global warming potential to carbon dioxide. And what is the time frame in which you're going to measure climate change, right? That is determined to be 100. Why is it 100? Because that is the lifetime of one molecule of CO2. That's
100 years.
yes. Even though the decay rate goes on for hundreds of years after that, but the most potent amount of climate change or heat trapping that carbon dioxide can do is at a very large horizon of time, which is 100 years. Now, what did the scientists do? Which is true across board for all negotiation. Take the path of least resistance. If CO2 is the largest greenhouse gas, CO2 is also politically speaking safe. Because if I am the prime minister of any country or president of any country, I don't have to worry about climate change discourse for the next 5, 10, 20 years of my regime. It's going to be a problem of the future, which is legally flawed. And we can talk about that. But when you have that longer time frame, what you're doing is you're talking about decarbonization, which is that when you look at all chemicals, the way they break up, the simplest form of that is going to be carbon dioxide. So it's a problem for the ages, so to say. That is the way it was marketed in the PR. Now, what has happened is, as science has evolved, as I was speaking, um, you're starting to see these erratic changes in climate, where you're starting to see in India, for instance, you have North India blistering heat. You have the glaciers melting, retreating. You have ocean currents change, coral dying off. These erratic changes or these sudden changes that happen to climate are because of the the integration of the general. You were talking about how the general slope is going to increase on a graph for heat, but then you have sudden spikes. These spikes over and above that increasing graph is caused by non CO2. So in the near term, when you experience 50 degrees centigrade plus temperatures in Delhi, that is all non CO2. That is not carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide increases the graph slowly. but it's not a sudden spike. That is why there is this duality. And that's why the research that you are pointing to says that the approach used by the government should be one that looks at the longer term decarbonization of carbon dioxide, because you have to do it. Without that, you can't do it. And then a near term sprint, which is speed. That's what you're hitting at. Because if you don't have speed, think about the cascading effect of that heat. You will not have rickshawalas, auto walas, sabzi walas be able to actually earn the livelihood. How do you justify labor working in this heat outside? And if you are not bothered about this section of society, how does anybody look at their children go to school and play in a playground like you and I had the luxury of doing? Today classrooms are air conditioned. How do you air condition a football field or a badminton court or a basketball court? So these very real term impacts are happening now as we speak. So this is not 100 years from now, this is now. Now, the duality would be, what is the government doing to protect us from heat now, today? And that is why, if you've seen the recent notification by the Ministry of Power and MNRE talking about the 20 to 28 degrees centigrade on air conditioning, that's also short lived climate pollutants.
Right. So, I mean, there has always been this case people have tried to make on the urgency of responding to climate change. I mean, and people were not able to sort of get their way in getting governments and policy changes, to sort of absorb this urgency. There has been a tendency, if you go look at COP after COP after COP, there haven't been really much happening in terms of the commitments being fulfilled. But wouldn't you say that the most obvious way to get that urgency going is to talk about these non-CO2
Exactly.
pollutants, right? So I just was wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about those individual players, this methane and hydrofluorocarbons, black soot. I don't know what tropospheric
Ozone.
ozone is. So of all these, I'm guessing methane is the most deadliest.
Yes.
Yeah. So
This
can
is
you just
second largest.
yeah.
Yes. So now that you know the answer to the problem, for all these years we were struggling to find the answer. The answer is a very simple one: do decarbonization in the longer term, and in the shorter term, you control, mitigate short lived climate pollutants and non CO2, right? It's not as simple as that. And it's not as simple as that because it's not a scientific problem, because you can find solutions to scientific problems. This goes deeper into the economic negotiations, finance negotiations, climate finance negotiations, trade negotiations, development negotiations, the whole lot of it. And the reason for that is, countries like India or the global south consider emissions of non CO2, especially methane, which is the second largest greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide, to be something called as survival emissions. Now, what are survival emissions? Survival emissions is defined generally defined by the government of India, or the general understanding of the term is that,
One would imagine CO2 is a survival emission.
correct,
Yeah.
but it isn't.
Okay.
It is methane, because methane is emitted from sectors of the Indian economy that are dealt with by the poorest of the poor. So, agriculture, for instance, which is the largest source of Indian methane emissions. India is the third largest emitter of methane globally, and our largest source of methane emissions is agriculture. So think about it. The poorest of the poor deal with that sector. So what the government of India does is, it says we will not negotiate on agriculture. So if you see our NDC, which is a nationally determined contribution, it's a plan that the government puts out in response to the Paris Agreement on climate. You will always see energy intensity numbers. You will never see a sectoral distribution of, here's how much we're going to reduce from energy, here's how much we're going to reduce from this sector and that sector. And that is done on purpose, because they do not necessarily want to divulge what it is that the agriculture sector might face. Now, it's a double edged sword. If you don't solve for agricultural emissions, and if you see the recent notification put out by the government on climate taxonomy, climate finance taxonomy, the document has nothing on climate, it's non CO2. That's one. Second, it sort of has divided the entire document into adaptation, mitigation, and sort of dealt with those sectors differently. And if you see agriculture, it's put into the latter, which is the adaptation basket. Adaptation is a very dangerous place to be in, Because in some sense, when you do adaptation, you are implying that you've lost the game. You've already sort of put your hands up and said, we've lost the game. So now we are going to
How
deal.
is it saying lost the game? If you're trying to adapt, you would be asking for technology, alternative technologies to make the
So what
transition,
is
right?
mitigation? Mitigation is we will mitigate our emissions from XYZ sector so that we're able to stop climate change or limit climate change, right? So it's an active, you're
Yeah. So in this scenario, I mean, many would argue that this is again an instance of climate politics at play because all these years the biggest polluters as in emitters have been the global north, right? So when it comes to their turn to pay for it by funding technology transfer, climate finance, mitigation, etc. By switching the topic to methane and non-carbon pollutants, are again putting the onus on the global south because they are agriculturally more dependent, more agriculture heavy. So now you are sort of switching the conversation to India cutting on methane emissions, etc., rather than keeping the focus on the global north who have been producing carbon all these decades and years, and still not doing enough for climate finance. So that is one.
absolutely
Yeah.
agreed. And which is why saying we are not going to talk about it, basically you are leaving the room where the negotiation is happening, right? Now, when you have left the room and the negotiation is going to happen between the people who anyway control the discourse on this issue, if you're losing your seat at the table, you're also losing your right to veto something, for instance. 45%, which is roughly 50% of all global methane emissions, come from the oil and gas sector. India doesn't have oil and gas sector emissions. If I were a climate negotiator for India, I would say absolutely. Let's start, negotiating methane. Let's start with the biggest problem, which is 50% of your oil and gas emissions. Who's accounting for it? Who's asking the question? My problem with the way negotiations are currently being held is it's either my way or the highway. That's not negotiations. If you want to negotiate, it's going to be a hard negotiation, but we know how to negotiate. India is a country that does not have to fear any external entity. We have the science on our side, we have the facts on our side, we have historical emissions on our side, and we are the largest growing economy in the world. If we are going to be the ones that are going to be scared, then what's the point? Think about it. Your oil and gas emissions should be tackled at the beginning. We can always argue that agriculture is a survival emission. So don't shut the door, negotiate it to be the last to exit. And domestically, one has to realize if you don't limit emissions from the agriculture sector, you are going to be hit really bad by something called as tropospheric ozone. If tropos methane is a precursor to tropospheric ozone,
So
what's going
tropospheric ozone is something which is created, not emitted.
correct.
Okay.
So methane creates it. When you emit methane, it goes into the atmosphere, chemical reaction happens, ozone is created, tropospheric ozone is created. What does tropospheric ozone do? It kills people, it reduces agricultural yields. So
Kills people how?
it causes pulmonary diseases and cancer, and it can also completely kill off agricultural yields. So my a better way, in my opinion, to go about this entire situation would be you negotiate on a very hard stance on what to do with methane. You ask for technology, you ask for climate finance, and we saw what happened at COP29, Azerbaijan Baku COP, where India's finance request was completely washed off. You open that channel again and say, how could you do that? It's absolutely absurd. They can't do that. And you also arm twist. That is diplomacy.
There is also this narrative which we find that this SLCPs, short-lived climate pollutant, they sort of distort the global carbon budget or undermine it in some way. So, can you explain this entire dynamic, how that works? Like, what happens? How does it?
See, you're asking a golden question that I don't think any scientist also has been able to crack yet. So, this is where it gets very interesting because now it's science plus politics again at play, right? GWP 100 concept that I was talking earlier is a flawed one. It's flawed because what you've done is you've benchmarked every gas's global warming potential to a 100-year benchmark. When you look at methane, which is the second largest greenhouse gas, its global warming potential on a 100-year scale reduces to 24, 25. If you do it on a 20-year
Is it
scale,
reduced to 24, 28 because it's
it
short
decays,
lived?
right? Yeah, exactly. The life
What is its
is
life?
12 years.
12 years. So after
Yeah.
12 years,
It sort
uh,
of decays.
so then will it cause
Yeah.
cooling?
Less. No. It
If it goes off the atmosphere, it should cause cooling because it was
no,
warming
it
earlier, right?
it traps less and less and less and less. Eventually it decays fully. That's why having 100-year GWP is good for all the political entities involved and the bureaucracy, because you don't have to worry about it. It's a 100-year problem. So it's the problem for the next generation, which is legally illegal. Uh, so
But people don't talk about 100-year time frames anymore. They're talking about 2030 and 2050 and so on.
that is the activist narrative. You look at the meat of the matter. Everything is, all your policies are benchmarked to 100 years. I mean, even if I look at what the Indian government is doing with the launch of the India carbon markets, for instance, they're all benchmarked to 100 years. You're not changing anything. Why? Because IPCC hasn't changed anything. They're also benchmarking it to 100. Why are they not changing it? Because politics, right? So when you have the entire system, top to bottom, cascading on a 100-year benchmark, you cannot necessarily evaluate accurately what the impact of methane is, because you are artificially, manually underplaying methane impact, and you are overplaying the impact of CO2, or sort of keeping it at a plateaued rate. That's the problem. So, carbon budget, you cannot truly define the carbon budget, because carbon budget is also being accounted for on a 100 GWP year. So, technically, the projections might say we will cross the carbon budget, let's say in 2040. In actuality, would have crossed way before that, because you're not accounting for different gases based on their lifetimes and global warming potential during their lifetimes. You're benchmarking it artificially to something that scientific models and economists can understand.
So what you're saying is the global carbon budget is pegged to carbon, which is
Yes.
100 years, whereas these guys have methane, which I mean these guys, they have a global warming potential of about 15 to 20
Yeah.
years. So the spikes in temperature would happen in a shorter
So
cycle.
even your carbon budget, so which is why I mean, if scientifically speaking, even 1.5-degree target under the Paris is not an accurate one, because what they forget telling you is we're already at 1.1.
But there were reports saying that in 2024 the temperatures had risen by 1.5 or something.
So that's a spike. So it's an annual average. If you look at the global average, we are at 1.1 degree centigrade rise in temperature. Paris Agreement says 2. Our expectation that we have morally set on ourselves is 1.5. Let's forget the 2, which is anyway a stretch. Let's even talk about 1.5, which is aspirational. Even that is flawed, because within 1.1 and 1.4, which is zero point 0.4 degrees centigrade, you will have something called as tipping points that are going to start get tipped.
Like for example, what is the tipping point?
Tipping point is a certain threshold in the Earth's atmospheric and Earth's systems, that once you cross that line, it's an irreversible change. So, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef that tips at 1.1 or 1.2, Arctic, which is the northern global northern shield, which basically is the backbone of everything as we know it, tips at
It
1.3.
says in it'll disintegrate and we won't.
It'll reach a threshold beyond which you cannot control the implications of that impact. You can't bring it back to its original
The
state.
change becomes
Yeah.
non-reversible.
Yeah. So if I could walk you through an example to better understand it, the Arctic, for instance, we have seen, so historically, as you can imagine, it was supposed to be all ice, just white shield. Every year in the summer for the last few decades, we have seen the Arctic sea ice be negligible in thickness or non existent in some parts of the Arctic. What I mean by tipping is, no matter what season it is, there will be no ice. You've tipped it. So it's an irreversible change. It will not happen. And the Arctic is warming 4 times the global average. Why does it matter to us? We are a tropical country. It matters to us because our entire rain fed agriculture, which is the Indian summer monsoon, gets completely disrupted by the loss of Arctic sea ice. And our climate models are also linear. What that means is if A happens, B will happen, C will happen. So it's linearity. So it's all linear. In climate models, what they are not able to currently assume or predict or even include is the fat tail risks, which is non-linearity, which basically means if A happens, here is the probability of C happening, Z happening, X happening, Y happening, M happening. That's how the earth works. It does not work in linearity. So if the science is flawed, and despite flawed science, if you Google scientific literature, it already tells you emergency, mayday, mayday, mayday. So you can well imagine what the actuality would look like.
Right. So you spoke about the Arctic changes in the Arctic and how it could impact, Indian agriculture and monsoons and so on. Now, coming to India specifically, I think some of the big sources of these non-carbon pollutants are waste management related. We have landfills. We've got like a glorious landfill in Gazipur in Delhi. So where does a country like India start with regard to cutting down emissions from waste management and landfills? Because we don't seem to have our landfill management itself in place. So how does this work? Like, where do we start in terms of trying to get hold of solutions to this emissions from these?
Landfills are a great example you've pointed us to. I think it was a couple of summers back when we had heard the news, the unfortunate news of the landfill catching fire here outside of Delhi, or just outside of New Delhi, rather. Um, that fire was started by emissions of methane being ignited by the heat. That is the circularity pattern that it took, and the whole thing went off. We all know what happened thereafter. The problem with our landfills, or for that matter of fact any sector, is not that there are no rules or bylaws or guidelines. I think we have a bit too much of it. The problem is enforcement. We have zero ways of enforcing anything in India. The rules are set. There will be a steering committee and an implementation committee and this committee and that committee and a task force and so on and so forth. But when it comes to actual implementation, that's where we've lost the game. And landfills, unfortunately, are one such sector where you cannot deal with implementation. We are a big failure when it comes to implementation. And
So
we
landfills basically means what? Methane and nitrous oxide. These are the main emissions from them.
know the landfills can be a group of, it can be a bunch of emissions, methane being one large one, which is caused by organic material in the landfill, even though it should not have gone there, but it has gone there. So, we don't have composting like the rest of the world. Have you ever composted anything? I haven't. Because, in fact, the other day I was trying to separate my waste, the wet and the dry waste. uh, the person who comes to collect the garbage, he yelled at me for doing it. It's like, oh, you're increasing my work, and took the two bins and sort of put it in the same bag. So urban local bodies need to play a very proactive role in managing landfills. So methane being one, the other is black carbon. We also burn a lot of the waste in the landfill. We don't know what is contained in a landfill. Even the Delhi landfills we have here, if you just go and try to understand what does this landfill, this mountain of trash contain, nobody will be able to tell you. So we have not understood what is contained in the landfill, the amount of organic material to be able to justify what the methane emissions from the landfill could be in order to do other downstream projects like gas capture and so on and so forth. So we can't do that because financially they're not viable. When you don't know how much gas could be potentially produced, why would any investor want to put money in there? Um,
But in terms of this burning phenomenon, there is also a lot of burning in rural areas, in forests, even inside national parks. When you travel, you'll see like chunks of forest which are burning. They have been set on fire. I don't know for as part of some agricultural or whatever regeneration or something like that. I don't know, but there is a lot of burning inside
You mean
Indian
farms?
forests. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Farms are burnt for a different reason. Waste in rural parts of India is burnt because there is no like waste management, so to say. So those are the different reasons. But as far as a farm is concerned, the farms are, which is parali, which is what
Yeah.
everybody keeps on talking about Delhi's air pollution.
Yeah.
It contributes a very small proportion of Delhi's air quality issue. It's transport, which is the main problem of Delhi's air pollution. But again, we need somebody to blame, so we blame, the farm fires. I'm not saying farm fires are justified, but it's a very small proportion of the problem. And the farm fire is done so that you can weed out.
Not just the farm fires. I mean, if you travel to Uttarakhand, Himachal, on those mountain sites,
That's
there are
plastic.
no, the trees are burnt. You have all those branches covered in black soot, and I don't know. I've seen this
I'm not
time.
aware of that.
Okay, okay. No, this. So I don't know if this is part of waste management, or is it because there are a lot of these dry leaves, or are they
Oh,
forest
yeah, yeah, yeah.
fires? Yeah.
So when you talk about leaves, for instance, you'll have a sweeper on the roads collecting all the leaves, the fallen branches together. Again, because we do not have composting in their head, because there will also be a supervisor who's going to ask them, "What have you done with this?" Right? So the easiest way is burn, which is even worse because black carbon, talking about global warming potential, is 50,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Okay, but thankfully its proportion in terms of the overall emission matrix is very less.
Black carbon exists in the atmosphere for 2 weeks. So how do you justify how much is enough and how much is lower, right? But the problem with, for instance, in Delhi, if you ask me what is the proportionality of black carbon, extremely high because you have PM 2.5, you have PM 10. So black carbon is a part of PM 2.5 and PM 10 emissions. So if your AQI is constantly high, that means your black carbon emissions are constantly high, which is worse, 50,000 times worse than carbon dioxide.
So I would imagine the answer to that would be to switch to electric. Is that
elect- Electric is going to be certainly a very important part of the puzzle, but I think the sectors, even in Delhi's policy, that we have completely foregone are the two wheeler vehicle emissions. We do not have any policy to deal with them. Even with challans, for instance, challans are always on four wheelers, it's not on two wheelers, and commercial vehicles, commercial freight.
one other aspect which comes up with this non CO2 guys is the overlap between pollution and climate change. So especially you also call them super pollutants and so on, and climate forces. So what exactly is do you think if it's difficult to get people to sort of really thinking about non CO2 climate pollutant, so on. If you just focus on air pollution and through that route, do you think it might be a good approach to try and address climate change as well, especially in the Indo-Gangetic plain, where every winter it becomes a huge issue?
The short answer is yes. And yes, mostly for urban centers of India, not necessarily the amount of impact you would see on a rural part of the country. Why urban India? Urban India, so even though I'm going to be ruffling a lot of feathers for saying this, black carbon has a direct linkage with climate change. But not a lot of government scientists are going to agree with that statement of mine because it has political connotations and impacts for the rest of the country and the people generally speaking.
What political connotation would black carbon?
If you are going to limit black carbon emissions, you are also limiting industrial application and industrial activity. That means your brick kilns are out of work. Just as you leave Delhi, your entire industrial belt in Sonipat, Garonda, and all of that area starts there. That is all going to be shut down. So, which is why there is an attempt, a purposeful attempt to sort of create a distinction between climate change and black carbon or air quality. And black carbon sort of falls through the cracks between them, between air quality issues and climate change. Does black carbon impact climate change and air quality? Absolutely, yes. Are our policies integrated enough to understand the nuances of how this could be done? No. So, for instance, A great example of this is an Economist article that was published based on several studies that we've been closely following. It's I think it's titled India's Unmasking Problem or something along those lines. Unmasking is a scientific phenomenon which says when you clean up your air, because solar radiation is going to increase substantially, your surface level temperature is going to increase substantially. So, what happens in Delhi right now? Let's talk about Delhi, and I'm just taking Delhi as an example. It happens across the world. If I clean up Delhi's air tomorrow, I am going to die of heat stress. Either I'm going to die of lung cancer because the pollution is going to give me pulmonary disease, and if I, and why does that happen? Because obviously, PM 2.5 goes into your bloodstreams, into your brain, into your lungs, wherever else it has to go to. But because you have these particles in the atmosphere, when you have incoming solar radiation, it sort of dissipates that powerful beam of light. So, what you are doing is you're essentially artificially, because of pollutants, breaking up the power with which you would have solar radiation enter your city or country or
So these
whatever.
particles reflect back the solar
They
radiation.
reflect some, they break some, there will be, some angular movement will happen. So it won't directly get hit onto the land and get captured there. That's the reason why we are saved from heat stress. Imagine at 50 degrees centigrade, I'm telling you, we are better off. Now, India has something called as NCAP, National Clean Air Program. Clean Air Program says the National Clean Air Program says we are going to clean up our air quality and we're going to reduce emissions of air pollutants by 40% compared to 2019 is the baseline, I believe. Has anybody thought if we actually attain our target, what's going to be the heat impact? Now,
So are there ways to calculate that? And
yes. In fact, we are working on one. So we're going to be working on understanding the range of what that sudden growth in temperature would look like, or sudden shoot up in that temperature would look like. That is going to be fatal. So, what is the need of the hour? The need of the hour is to integrate air pollution policies with climate policies, because if you don't integrate it, one way or the other, you're going to die, depending on what is your fate.
so we have spoken about carbon, we have spoken about methane, we've spoken about tropospheric ozone, black soot. I was just wondering if you can just take our listeners through this entire nitrogen oxide phenomenon, which is not a short-lived climate pollutant. It's not a necessity, but it is still very dangerous, and it is often spoken of in association with these elements as well. So, I understand a lot of it is again from agriculture, and on that, I have a very specific question: would a shift to organic agriculture help at all? Because that is being pushed as a solution in many different domains. Go to organic, both at the retail level and at the farmer level. So is that like go for organic cotton, etc., etc.? So what are your thoughts there?
So, nitrous oxide, which is commonly referred to as N2O, the global source of it is from the ag sector, but within the ag sector, predominantly, like methane is predominantly from rice growing paddy fields. Nitrous oxide comes predominantly from the use of synthetic fertilizer manure. Um, and nitrous oxide, like you said, is not a short lived gas, it's a longer lived gas, but it is several times more potent than carbon dioxide. It, apart from being a greenhouse gas, a super potent greenhouse gas or a super pollutant, it also is a top notch ozone depleting substance. What that means is uh, every time nitrous oxide is emitted, it goes into the atmosphere, high levels of the atmosphere, and it reacts with different components of the atmosphere there, and it damages the ozone layer. Ozone depleting substances are also bad because you get skin cancer. One way or the other, you're getting a cancer. And for the use of fertilizer and for the climate emissions, once you emit nitrous oxide, it also sort of breaks into smaller components like ammonia and other oxides of nitrogen. Those are super pollutant, short-lived climate pollutants. So it's a cyclical process, if you will. right? Move to organic farming. I'm not an agricultural expert. I do not know. The short answer is yes, but I do not know what the impacts on food security would be. We've seen Sri Lanka. Try that out. It was disastrous. What is the silver bullet there? I am not sure, and I do not know. What sectors should be done? How should that plan be developed? What should the organic fertilizer industry be doing? So on and so forth. We don't know. The other thing to look at is the manure and fertilizer lobby in India.
Hmm.
Like, ask questions.
Organic would.
Organic manure works, but again, I'm not sure, because we've also now reached a point with green revolution where we've used so much manure, artificial synthetic manure and fertilizer, that we've also seen resistance to bacterial resistance, viral resistance to these chemical compounds. I am not an expert, and therefore I don't know what the implications of rolling this out would be. And I'm very skeptical, given that we had the Sri Lanka case study right before our eyes. So theoretically it seems right, but practically I don't know.
So what are the so when we're running out of time. So one last question where you can probably sum up. What percentage or magnitude does the planet and India need to reduce its SLCPs plus nitrous oxide? Yeah, and is there any roadmap or projection that we have as a some kind of something to work with in this regard?
50% at least is the short sweet answer, because it's 50% of the problem, right? The unseen 50% of the problem. Again, like, I think the answer needs to be developed over time with the political will to be wanting to work on it, and domestically, not internationally. What you do internationally, all of us fully know, involves a lot of politics, so that is up to.
So this 50% is both at the planetary level and India specifically.
So all gases are homogeneously mixed. Everybody around the world would have to slash emissions by 50% in order to have any impact. And if nobody does it, then no one country will see the impact. It's not like, I'll stop
It's not
burning
like
something. It's not localized.
If India reduces by 90%, it's not going to benefit us because others aren't
No,
doing
but it
their.
depends. It depends on what you're reducing. If you reduce black carbon by 90%, you will have localized impacts. If you reduce 90% of methane, so to say, but on a very large scale, you will see urban impacts of it. But the more the homogeneous the gas, the lesser the localized impacts. That's what it is, which is why the most amount of impact you will see with is going to be with black carbon. How to do it? A very simple method to do this, which has not been adopted yet, and it is my recommendation to the government or whoever else has the power to do this. If we're able to inventory our emissions of non CO2, again, I am not asking the government to run with it internationally, but domestically for policymakers, if you're able to inventory our non CO2 emissions at the district level, and we've done this, so we know this, you get a treasure trove of data. What that tells you is, I can tell you today in the states that we work with, um, exactly what are the hotspots of different emissions and pollutants. So all I have to do as the state government is to take care of the first 10, top 10. Top 10 for black carbon, top 10 for methane, top 10 for nitrous oxide, top
Top
10
in
for
what exactly sectors?
acids.
Acids. Okay, as in
Acids.
the entities which are
The
produced.
entities. So, for instance, if I knew at a district level what is the emission of every industrial unit, which, by the way, the government collects data on, it, we just don't know what happens to it. Goes into some sort of a black hole, never comes out. But if you analyzed using simple models, I could tell you in a given state what are the top five most problematic assets or entities or factories that need the most amount of investment or need to be shut down. If you have that level of insights using data, we are a very smart country. That's all you need to do. It's not like you have to get crores and crores or millions of dollars from
Okay,
somewhere
let's say
to.
you've got I don't know how many districts India has. Let's say we do all of this for all the districts, and you've got all the data, and you can't shut down. So what do we do then? Do we have alternative
Yes.
technologies for all these various SLCPs, for methane, for nitrogen oxide, and for HFCs? We didn't get to talk about hydrofluorocarbons. All those air conditioning related entities. So do we have that kind of technology, or do we again India need to go and ask for money for this climate transition, climate finance, and so on?
India should ask for money nonetheless.
Okay.
That should be India's strongest position, absolutely. Because historical emissions and the burden of historical emissions is on the global north, and we should never ever let that go, because it is what it is. We are also a large economy. We might be the third or the fourth largest economy in the world, but you see the per capita emissions and you see the per capita income. It's a huge gap between what the national level numbers look and what the per capita numbers look. So negotiating internationally is a completely separate ball game. Domestically, uh, we hadn't gotten any time to talk about air conditioners, but let's talk about air conditioners. It was the Department of Science and Technology that launched something called as the global cooling price, and we were able to find technology and the perfect mix of technology, which is energy efficient compressors and the refrigerant gas, to maximize energy efficiency and minimize emissions from ACs. What is the plan of implementation? You did a competition, competitors won. Now what? So you have to develop a supply chain in order to bring that technology that you have awarded and recognized into production, into mass
Are we
production.
still using the other R32? We're not using the right R, whatever 160 or
So
whatever is.
R32 is commonly used. R32 is also not a low global warming potential gas, it's a mid range global warming potential gas. R32 is 90% of India's residential AC.
Yeah.
You have to transition away from R32 also. It's a pretty good step down, but it's not where
So why
the.
isn't that happening? Consumers don't care whether it is R32 or R9 9000. They just want their AC. So why isn't that? Why in the
That is
manufacturers?
where because, well, negotiations on that also. Montreal Protocol is the treaty, global treaty, that fall under the steps of this. We have a national ozone office. Our transitions are scheduled to be after the developed world. So we are in something called as Group Two. First, Group One goes, which is all developed countries, broadly speaking, and then Group Two goes. Group Two is where India is. India can very easily jump to Group One if it chooses
So how
to.
does this work? Because most of our ACs come from developed countries, Daikin and Carrier.
Compressors.
Okay, not the gases.
We are making gases in India as well. Daikin is also the producer of R32, and then we have joint ventures with Daikin and other Indian gas manufacturers. So licensing could be one option. We are also producing others. Propane, for instance, is not a patented material. The reason why we are not going to other lower degree alternatives is because the gases that have very low GWP are patented by Honeywell and DuPont in the US, which again should be negotiated. If you want to save the planet so desperately, might as well give us a license or a low patent fee. So, India is a smart country. We're waiting for the patents to expire.
Right. So hopefully the patents expire, or we negotiate our way to get those gases for the HFCs. And also, I hope we are able to get the other kinds of technology transfers and the political will domestically for enforcing these kinds of transitions and adaptations and mitigation strategies. That's all I have for you in this episode, Zarin. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.